My dear friends, welcome back to the show. Joseph Bloch, also known as Greyhawk Grognard. And if you haven't watched his YouTube channel, Greyhawk Grognard, you absolutely should. He puts on some very entertaining bits, whether they have to do with gaming explicitly or things that just tie into gaming. His adventure modules, I think they're modern greats. That's just my opinion, and I know a lot of people agree with me. And the reason we're here today is we're going to talk about news of the weird, conspiracy theories, more esoteric topics like that. Because my man here, when we were doing the short interview segment for my review of R1 Into the Great Rift that he put out, he hit me with the fact that the Derro, the psychic subterranean dwarves that are nuts and vicious, have a real world founding to at least the story, at least to the characters. And I wanted to know more. And it turns out, Joe would like to talk more about subjects like that. So that's why we're here today. We may or may not talk about gaming. I think we're going to have a great time regardless. So, Joe, welcome back.
Thank you for having me. I can't wait to be talking about the Fortiana.
I do just want to do a little table setting here for how I conceive of conspiracy theories and more esoteric explanations of real world phenomenon. Is that some conspiracy theories, which I'll refer to all that as conspiracy theories for sake of this episode, are pants on head crazy. They really are. Like this book right here. Nothing in this book is true, but
God.
it's exactly how things are. This thing is insane. I've tried reading it, and my program observer did make it through the whole thing. When I thought he was about to make a point, like a crazy person, his thoughts just swirled around again and again and again. And it's like a friggin' toilet that won't stop flushing here. It's entertaining, but there's not really much I can do with it. There wasn't really any evidence to go with the claims put in there. Maybe you approach things this way, Joe. I'd love to hear your thoughts. But I look at things from a scientific method perspective. What can I see? What can I prove with what I see? And what can I theorize based on what I'm observing? And what kind of predictive power does that have moving forward? In order for something to meet the criteria of the scientific method, it has to have those things. It has to be observable by you and other people, and that means it has to be repeatable, and then you have to be able to do something with it. It also has to be falsifiable, because if you have one explanation that explains everything about the world and can never be disproven, you don't have science, you have religion, you have a myth, you have something like that. So I like to see at least a little bit of evidence with what I'm looking at here, and to think about it in those terms. Joe, do you have a lens through which you like to look at these kind of things?
I'm an occultist, an esotericist myself. While I agree with you about the scientific method and what's required to use it, I think it doesn't go far enough into subjective, because there are some things that plainly exist, but are not what you might call empirically provable, demonstrable. They're only observable by secondary or tertiary effects. So, like human emotions, for example, perfect example of that. We all know they exist. We all see them existing, but we don't see the emotions themselves. We see the expression of the emotions. So we're sort of one step removed from the cause. We're talking about something that makes a real world claim, like the earth was created 6,000 years ago. That is something that is making a claim that is within the realm of the scientifically provable or disprovable in this case. So we do see things, claims that are made in the occultist world, in the religious world, and so forth, that are testable by that means because they're making real world claims. That's as far as that goes. But some of them also make claims that don't deal with the real world, but rather with secondary or tertiary effects on the real world. And that's where I think you see a sort of a gap, where the scientific method, while valuable, isn't universally applicable in these cases. And a lot of the weird stuff that that you want to talk about falls into that category.
That's very true. I do also acknowledge that there are some things that scientific method is inapplicable to. You raised a great point for that, because not everything can be measured with a ruler or a tape measure or a scale or things like that. And yet we know they really do exist. They're true. They have weight to them. They're important. So now that we got that out of the way, Joe, where do you want to start? Do you have a
Well,
starting point you'd like?
well, you brought up the Derros. Let's dive off that board first.
Yes. So just a little bit of context for folks who might not have seen the review of R1, which you absolutely should check out. It's a great module, and our interview in it's good too. There's a flying ship that Joe gives the Derro in the adventure. And I asked him, why did you give him the flying ship? And then he dropped all kinds of cool stuff on me. So, Joe.
Well, the literary origin of the Derro comes from something called the Shaver Mystery, which was a big thing in the 40s and 50s in UFO magazines. It's based on this one guy, Shaver, who wrote these articles, lengthy screeds about the Derro, which were this underground race of dwarves living in the hollow earth who could manipulate people using ray beams. And they had UFOs that were coming out of Antarctica and so forth. So just everything that ever bad happened to you is the fault of these Derro. They started printing them in these UFO magazines, and then people started writing in saying, yes, this is right. I know this. I agree. I've seen it. This has happened to me too. And it's just this huge following for decades of thousands of people who all bought into this Derro conspiracy called the Shaver Mystery. That's where Gary Gygax, who obviously invented D&D, got the idea for these Derro as underground dwarves who were, evil and manipulative and so forth. So when I was writing that particular module, I was using the Derro as the villains because I love them as villains. And I kind of went back to the source and started plugging in a bunch of stuff from the Shaver Mystery into it. And the flying saucer was one of them.
So do you think that it is the case that those tens of thousands of people, perhaps hundreds of thousands of people, were all lying? Every one of them. None of them actually believed what they were saying.
Not at all. I think that is the most unlikely thing because you're not going to get tens of thousands of people all agreeing on the same lie just spontaneously. There is something called a fantastic personality, which is a psychological thing where people tend to fantasize and embellish the real world in order to make it more interesting and in order to make themselves feel more special. Like these special things are happening to me, so I must be special. And I think it's more a case of that in a lot of cases where people see something that sounds really cool and semi-plausible in that context, and they glom onto it and they say, yes, this has happened to me too, as a way of getting in on the bandwagon and sort of sharing the specialness of Mr. Shaver, who's experienced all this. Well, if he has, so have I, and that makes me, special like he is. He gets his stuff written in a magazine, so he must be special. And if I agree with him and I write a letter in and they publish my letter, then I'm special too. I think that there's a lot of that going on in this phenomenon. And you see that in all over there are these social epidemics that pop up with different things. And I think you see a lot of that in that. It's not just limited to underground dwarves and UFOs. Uh, moral panics begin like this, the satanic panic from the 80s, McCarthyism, although that was a little more grounded in reality than the satanic panic, the witch hunts, that kind of thing. So I think this is a recurring thing that you see, and it can express itself horrifically, or it can express itself in kind of harmless pottery.
I got you. So, Shaver, do you think he was full of it? Do you think he was crazy? Or is there another explanation?
It's really impossible to tell because, first of all, his story changes over time,
Mm.
and it gets more and more embellished. And this is one of those instances where he makes real world claims that are disprovable. He claimed he was physically taken underground into one of their cities. So that's the kind of thing that is provable in its way. As far as whether or not he was just being completely cynical and making this stuff up to sell articles and magazines, there's probably a little of that going on because, this it end up being his living, as I understand it. So I think in this particular case, there's probably a little bit of P.T. Barnum going on in there. But as to whether or not he originally really believed this had happened to him, and then he just kind of took that kernel and embellished it over the years, it's impossible to parse that part out as to what was his psychological origin of this. Where did it come from in his mind, regardless of whether or not the later proof was kind of embellished for the sake of popularity and money and so forth, whether that he really believed that first incident happened. I don't think we can ever really know.
Yeah, and I wonder because there's both older analogies to that as well as ones that came afterwards that kind of speak to some of those core elements of the story itself. Because if you look at like Scandinavian folklore, you do have subterranean dwarves that do weird stuff. And that's not limited to just that one geographical area. So were those people just making it up? And then he was also just making it up? And then one that I would believe is just making up would be L. Ron Hubbard, because some of that sounds familiar to his Thetan idea. about
Yeah.
how you're possessed by these things, and instead of you being possessed by them, you're just getting hit with ray guns by subterranean dwarves. It kind of has that same flavor to it. I just wonder if there was a kernel of something that really happened in the real world that gives these different groups the idea to come up with such a concept over time, or if it's just all bunk.
Well,
And
it's funny you should mention Scandinavia, because there's something related to this whole thing that's known up there. And Arctic explorers reported this in like the 19th century, is that every once in a while you'd come across an ice floe or something that was covered in pollen, in like tropical pollen. And that's where the idea of this black ice or blue ice comes from. And in fact, Gygax incorporated that into the Greyhawk campaign when he has the land of black ice at the far north. That, I think, is a reference to this phenomenon that happens where you get these icebergs that are covered in tropical and temperate pollen. And people started to think that that was blowing in from the hollow earth. You have the hollow earth with a big hole at the top, and that's how you go into the hollow earth. Then the thesis was that all this pollen and warm currents and so forth were coming in from the hollow earth, which of course has its own sun inside. Uh, and we're coming out at this big hole. And there's supposed to be a hole at the North Pole and at the South Pole. And, you get these stories of Arctic explorers who claim to have seen tropical jungles and stuff at the poles. I think Admiral Byrd even is said to have reported that in the South Pole when he was doing like an overflight. He's trying to be the first man to fly over the South Pole or something. I might be getting the details wrong, but a very famous Arctic explorer reported that he actually flew into the hollow earth and saw these jungles and everything and flew out, and then the story was suppressed. So there's a lot of things like this that go along. I mean, I don't want to get too regressive in terms of, what was the ultimate origin of these myths, because they are found pretty universally about diminutive underground creatures. You see them with the fairy folk in Celtic mythology. You see them with the Dvergar and the Alfar in Norse mythology. The Greeks had them, the Egyptians, it's a pretty ubiquitous thing across human culture to have this scale there. And when you have something that is that widespread, it does tend to make you think that maybe there was some origin in the hoary mists of time, where maybe this originated with some encounters with unknown hominids that were cave dwellers, pre-Neolithic age or something like that, because we have remember those hobbits were found in Java or something like that, and
yeah.
they were around not too long before recorded history. It is not outside the realm of possibility that in some other location there were some encounters like that, or maybe like a folk memory that endured over the years and became the origins of this. Remember the movie the 13th Warrior did this, where I think the underground dwellers were supposed to be Neanderthals or something, and they come out, and this is a whole nexus of this kind of stuff. And Lovecraft, in fact, wrote a couple of stories about that too, if I recall.
And I do want to add as well that in the field of social sciences, and when statistics get involved and when you're surveying the public, there's always the question of, are they lying to us or are they not? Well,
Right.
I think that even if you're being the most rigid in assuming that as many of them as possible are liars, there's going to be some that really believe it. And it's just a question of what scale it is. So I would at least give the benefit of the doubt. I would hear out people that make claims like, I flew into a jungle in the hollow earth, things like that. And I've never been to either pole. I can't say what it looks like. I know what other people have shown me what it's supposed to look like, but how do I know that for a fact that's what it actually looks like unless I've seen it with my own eyes? I don't know. So I'm open-minded. And even if we don't wind up changing the world with this discussion, it's fun to think about. If we get a detail wrong here or there, if someone's interested in the idea, they can Google it and go check it out for themselves,
And don't forget, like they said on Seinfeld, it's not lying if you believe it's true.
I think that holds up in court too. Um,